Writer-director Whit Stillman stands apart from all other New York City filmmakers. He doesn't luxuriate in the squalor of street life like Sidney Lumet or Martin Scorsese. This doesn't mean he isn't aware of it either. Critics glibly label Stillman the wasp Woody Allen. He's not. It is more accurate to say Stillman does for wasps what Spike Lee did for the African-American middle class. That is, he acknowledges their existence and dares to take us inside the inner circle and locate the humanity. Stillman's first feature, 1990's Metropolitan, was a Christmas-time comedy of manners chronicling the tentative rituals of debutante parties and the scary transition from adolescence to adulthood. It was like a Charlie Brown Christmas crossed with a John Updike story, but startlingly gentle in its portrayal of privileged kids discovering that good fortune doesn't guarantee a good life. 1994's Barcelona saw Stillman re-team with Metropolitan co-stars Taylor Nichols and Chris Eigeman for a military service romantic comedy about enforcing American foreign policy and disorientation. Actually, it was another lilting comedy of manners with Eigeman emerging as a new kind of leading man, a fast-talking romantic cynic. 1998's The Last Days of Disco caps off Stillman's unofficial trilogy of yuppie manners. Like the previous films, Disco was an elegant talk fest, a requiem for a time when talking and dancing the night away held the promise of good times to come. Tonight, with the Criterion Collection release of The Last Days of Disco, we pay tribute to the films of Whit Stillman. We begin with my recorded interview with Stillman from early last week. We touch upon the origin of his stories, casting, the use of music, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. But we begin where all my interviews begin, on his earliest memories of films. As a young person, as a kid, what was the first movie you remember that left an impression on you?
Well, the first movie I remember seeing was Bambi, and of course Bambi leaves a big impression. And Bambi, in fact, left an impression on The Last Days of Disco.
Right. And do you remember maybe growing up a little, in your teens or in your youth, were you interested in film? Were there certain filmmakers or actors that, just as a casual fan, you followed?
Well, I was just thinking about that because I was reading Kazan's book about directing, and he was speaking highly of Richard Widmark. And I remember Richard Widmark being my favorite actor, but it was when he was in Westerns. So it was the Richard Widmark of Westerns that I liked.
And coming from, New York and upstate New York where you grew up, I mean, when you saw Westerns, was that kind of foreign to you? Was that?
Well, I lived on a farm.
Oh, okay.
I lived on a farm in Cornwall-on-Hudson, New York, and Cornwall-on-Hudson is just the next mountain over from West Point, and there are a lot of we were on the mountain. There are a lot of military families there. The future General Petraeus was in my elementary school.
Really?
Yeah, and
did you Did you know him?
I can't remember him now.
Wow.
I think we were in different classes, but I was amused to read that he had come from Cornwall too, because there's a real military tradition and feeling in Cornwall-on-Hudson with the West Point influence. One of my best friend's father was a maintenance man at West Point, and then another fellow was the son of a general, and his elder brother was a captain. So we had a instructor of tactics at West Point, coaching our war games, and so it was. And in my period, Westerns were the films we liked.
Mm-hmm. And what about reading as a kid? Were you a voracious reader, or?
Well, I was slow to learn how to read. When I was living in the sticks, I didn't learn much of anything. And then the family moved back to Manhattan, and I was there for 2 years, and went to a very good school and learned how to read and started reading a lot. And in those days, there was a series that we liked a lot called Landmark Books, and they had a lot of sort of heroic biographies of characters like the Swamp Fox, Francis Martin the Swamp Fox. And so that was another, avenue of hero worship.
Yeah. And what about when you got into, obviously high school and college, when you're assigned, reading over the summer in the books in the books you read in English class, were there ones that you gravitated more over the others? I mean, did you gravitate more towards, I remember I think it was my freshman year in high school, you read, over the summer you're supposed to read Jane Eyre and Tale of Two Cities, and I remember I was an odd man out because I preferred Jane Eyre over Tale of Two Cities.
Yeah. I really want to read Jane Eyre because I was working on this project at one point called Red Azalea by Anchi Min, a memoir of a woman during the Cultural Revolution in China. And Jane Eyre figures in that. It was very controversial. Someone got in trouble for reading Jane Eyre, so it made me very interested in reading it. For me, the life-changing book that I read was recommended by my sister, as many things in my life were recommended by my elder sister. And I was in my first year in boarding school, the Millbrook School. We called it, I guess that was sophomore year in high school terms. We called it fourth form year. And she said I should read This Side of Paradise by Fitzgerald. I was 15, and just at that point I was getting involved in sort of Manhattan social life with preppy girls, and it all sort of fit into the Fitzgerald world, and I loved This Side of Paradise, and I read all of Fitzgerald then, and it started turning me towards Metropolitan.
Just real quick, what's your take on Great Gatsby?
Well, I liked Great Gatsby very much, but Great Gatsby is the artwork. It's the most artistically successful and wonderful book. But sometimes, if you're a fan of an author, it's not just the masterwork you like. And
right.
In those days, I loved This Side of Paradise. I've tried to read it subsequently and thinking about trying to do a version of it as a movie or something like that. But you'd have to sort of reinvent it as a film story. The book, I don't think it holds up. The feeling of it might hold up, but there's too much nonsense in it.
And that kind of, oddly enough, that's kind of the same thing with Gatsby when they try to do it in film, and they think, because I guess filmmakers may think that there's not much, it's all action, or there's always something you can photograph, but there's actually a lot of internal stuff going on, and so in Great Gatsby, and you try to externalize that, and it just looks kind of silly after a while.
I also have a question the way the whole sort of phenomenon of adapting books to movies. I mean, sometimes it's been done beautifully well, Gone Over the Winter and that well, blah, blah, blah. But I think as a working method, I much prefer to be inspired by something, but not adapt it, not have the rights bought, not have it based on something, but just say, well, here, we all love this book. Is there any way we can get this kind of world on screen? It won't be this book, it won't be this story, but can we be inspired by this and create something along these lines? And I think that's a more creative, happier way to go.
Right. Well, and then you were abroad, I guess, and this is kind of interesting, you were abroad in the 70s, and your first foray, I guess, into the movie world, wasn't into writing or acting, but was in, you kind of, from what I've read, you kind of talked your way into being a salesperson of Spanish language films to sell.
That was in the 80s, yeah. In the 80s, I did that thanks to the wonderful Variety of those years. Variety, in the old days, before Peter Barr took it over, was this thick newsprint source of incredible amounts of information, and had this crusty staff, people really well informed about every country's film business. And there's a guy named Peter Besas, the reporter from Madrid, and I really wanted to get into the film business. I was working for a publication that crashed and burned, but they overpaid us a bit, so I'd save some money. And I was getting married to a woman from Spain, and so on the flight over to get married, I read the Variety special issue on the Spanish film industry and read it 3 times and sort of memorized it. And at a dinner party in Madrid, I met these producers and they had the impression that I knew something about the Spanish film industry, I knew something about the film industry, and they gave me their films to sell in the United States. And I realized that really you don't just sell films from one country, you should sell them worldwide. But I wanted to make films, and I just thought, I have to get it in some way or another, and this is a way in.
And Metropolitan was your first film. Am I right? And originally, you started out as a novel, but then you turned it in. You started working it as a script. Is that true?
Not exactly. I mean, I wanted to. My original ambition when I fell in love with Fitzgerald and all that was to, when I stopped wanting to follow my father's would-be career, which was, democratic politics, run for office, and in my college interview, they asked me what I wanted to do, and I realized, oh my gosh, I said all this political stuff, but I realized I don't want to do it. And so I wanted to try to write fiction, write a novel, but even in college, I decided I didn't have the stamina to write in solitude that way, and got interested in film and TV, comedy. And so I was aspiring to film and TV comedy, but I was having such a hard time writing fiction and short stories, I wondered if I could ever do it. And I started writing first the Barcelona script 1 year, but I had a over full-time job. Mm-hmm. And then I said, well, this is an ambitious thing to do a film in a foreign country. I should do something minimalist that I could do very cheaply in New York. And that's when I started writing the Metropolitan script.
Yeah, and just as a digression, was there a filmmaker or a style of film that you latched onto? Not latched onto, but you said, if I could do something similar to this. I mean, obviously, I'm sure you got on the junkets, and when Metropolitan first came out, I remember I was only 12, but I remember even reading, Whit Stillman is preppy into the Woody Allen, and
yeah,
I'm sure you saw that.
Well, there's one. I mean, all this is kind of struggling in the dark because things were just starting to break. It seemed to me in independent film, and I remember reading a New York article about how Spike Lee made She's Gotta Have It, and trying to figure out from the numbers they mentioned in the article how much he spent on making the film. And John Sayles had done Return of the Soccer 7, which was kind of the first thing giving us an idea that we could kind of turn our short story writing into filmmaking. And for me, a very helpful thing was a screenplay book of the Big Chill screenplay. It was very, very helpful seeing how that was structured. And, I was just trying to copy a little bit of the format of a screenplay. And it was when word processors were very rudimentary. I had my old K-Pro clunky thing. And I remembered that I thought it was kind of a pain centering dialogue. So I just had dialogue flush left, and I just cut it off, so it didn't go all the way across the page, so it looked like dialogue, but it was flush left. And then we were trying to get help in the film. I knew no one in the business exactly would finance our film, but we wanted to see if someone at the Tisch School at NYU would help us, with our actors or show people around. And a very prissy woman said, "Oh, I can't help you if you have a screenplay written on a screenplay format. You're not serious, blah, blah, blah." And she was the only person who snobbed us because we didn't have the dialogue in the center of the page.
Well, I got to ask on Metropolitan, and because I guess he does run through all your films. How did you come across Chris Eigeman?
It was remarkable. We had essentially the right age group targeted for Metropolitan, and the girlfriend of one of the cartoonists and artists I represented in the illustration agency that I was working in then had been a casting assistant, so she knew about how to do it. So we put a free announcement in Backstage, the Actors Journal in New York, and we rented space at the Musical Theater Works. Sort of unusual big expenditure for us. And I tried to write an ad making it sound as serious and a project as possible that was, get made and get out there. And over 300 people showed up. We were just mobbed. And at the beginning, we didn't realize we were mobbed, so the first 50 people we gave callbacks to. And among them were the key people in the cast, including Chris Eigeman and Carolyn Farina, and I think Alison Rutledge Parisi. And So Chris came back and read, and we thought it was good. He read more, and we really thought it was good. And then at some point, Will Kemp came into a later audition, and I thought, wow, Chris Eigeman is acting the part of Nick. Will Kemp is Nick. And totally wowed me. And then we went through some different changes, and Will Kemp was just huge and kind of scared and intimidated Ed Clements, our Tom character. And that didn't work at all. So we went back to Chris Eigeman playing Nick, and then Will Kemp played Rick. And there's certain animosity between them, and it worked really pretty well there.
And you had this, and I guess just because he's been in your 3 films, it's been inevitable that some writers have said that Chris Eigeman kind of mouths possibly your philosophy. But I wouldn't think that to be true. And that one thing I've noticed in watching these films is that you seem to have always 2 characters that are polar opposites, and that one is a total idealist, and the other one is, and possibly a little naive, and the other one was once idealist but now is cynical. But by the end of the film, they've restored a little bit of their idealism. And Chris Eigeman seems to have played variations on that in these 3 films. His character in Metropolitan in Barcelona and Last Days of Disco, of this someone who basically, by the end, has a little bit of his idealism restored.
I think that the character that Chris Eigeman really plays is kind of how to describe that kind of character. They're going in different directions at the same time, and so I wouldn't say that it's like cynic becoming an idealist, because I think there's a kind of idealism and cynicism, like a cinnamon roll twisted through the whole thing. And each of the characters is a little bit different, but it's essentially the Chris Eigeman character. And before the Chris Eigeman character as a character on the page, and I saw Chris as a great dramatic actor. He seemed like a Shakespearean actor when he came in, very serious, very glum, and he'd be good with dark material. And I didn't know if he was a comedy guy at all. I worried about him. That's why I panicked and had Will Kemp come in for a while. And then we worked on it a lot in the first few scenes that we shot for Metropolitan, and he got it. He was great. And I remember a film director at these film events that were later saying, this guy, this actor in Stillman's film is the guy who's making it happen. And it's sort of true. The way Chris played that part and how it worked, he was like kind of a comedy machine, a drama comedy machine in that. And then he kept on in the other two films. And I'm really glad he was in Disco, because there's huge pressure from kind of conformist, conventional types that we not work with each other, blah, blah, blah. And they wanted a bigger name in that part and all these kind of things. And I'm really glad he was in Last Days of Disco, too. It really helped. And
looking at Last Days of Disco, do you kind of, some of the pressures you might have had on making that film, which was your 3rd film, and it was, I'm assuming it was your biggest budgeted film of the 3 in the studio, and do you find a little amusing now looking back that you were getting pressure to get quote unquote name stars, and you went with these actors, Kate Beckinsale, Chloe Sevigny, and so forth, to where now if you were making Last Days of Disco, these would be the people they'd want in the film.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, there's a lot of skepticism about the cast. It's very strange, the idea of who is hot in Los Angeles. It's sort of the people who are about to break in 2 months, and they seem to think that the world has entirely forgotten anyone who was well-liked 2 years before, as if the rest of the world doesn't have a kind of longer memory span.
Right.
So I was at this party in Cannes a couple of years ago, and I was totally, alone at this party. I had no one to talk to, and finally some people from the States showed up, and they said, "Oh, your actor is in a TV show, and he's very successful, and he's very good in the show. It's very big." And I went on and on, and I didn't know who's my actor, and it turns out you're talking about Robert Sean Leonard in House, and Robert Sean Leonard has had a huge career and was hugely important before I was making films, and I love the fact that, according to the film, he is now our actor. But when Robert was put in in disco, he was very big in New York, and our extras and the people working in the film were just thrilled to have him around because he was doing such great theater in New York, but in the industry, oh no, this doesn't count, he's not a star, blah, blah, blah. It's really terrible.
Dead Poet Society was a decade ago, and that might as well be 100 years ago in Hollywood.
It's just ridiculous. And the rest of the world, they love Robert Sean Leonard, and he's very appropriate for being in the film. And he was a wonderful misdirect because you see him in the beginning of the film, you think it's going to be about him, and then it ends up going a different direction.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit about. I'm curious because some of the characters and some of the philosophy of some of these films, Metropolitan Barcelona, is that a lot of these characters, because of their families and the privilege they had, they always seem to be kind of counter. They seem to be arguing against some of this stuff, whether it's in Barcelona, preppies or yuppies in disco, or questioning the debutante scene in Metropolitan that this Tom Townsend character sort of does, and I found this kind of interesting in that in disco, a lot of these characters are drawn to the disco. I'm wondering, in you personally, in you talk about this, that this was the scene you were in. I'm kind of curious on what, if you were also intrigued, or were you not aware of also the punk scene, which was also kind of...
Well, I was very aware of it, and I just absolutely detested it.
Really?
I mean, I was just appalled.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was totally shocked.
Mm-hmm.
Because remember, when the punk scene emerged for us, it was just weird people wearing swastikas. I mean, it just seemed just disgusting.
Right.
And we really took a drubbing when disco came out. All the people who very proudly said that they were only interested in punk music in the period and hated disco and blah, blah, blah. And then they belabored us and bludgeoned us that our disco film was not accurate and not authentic or something like that, based on I don't know what, because they proudly said how much they hated disco, blah, blah, blah. So obviously, retrospectively, it's very cool to say you're into the punk scene and all that, and it's not cool to say you're into the disco scene, but I don't agree. I love disco because I hated rock and I hated punk, and finally it was stuff we liked, and just tons of people felt the way I did, and I think we've won in a lot of ways. I think disco has not died. I think the idea that disco went so far out and all that, not really true. I think it has continued, and it's amazing how disco is belabored for being mechanical and repetitive and artificial in all these ways, and yet there's no criticism of music that's infinitely more mechanical and repetitive and tedious. Right.
And the soundtrack to disco, I'm kind of curious, was this because it's kind of here's a film. I mean, I think the soundtrack to disco might have been even more successful at the time of its release, just because it's 10, 11 years later, and this is still probably one of the best single CD compilations of disco that's out there, and it's a soundtrack.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree. I think we're really lucky with that. Yeah.
And I'm curious, did you have songs picked out beforehand and knew what would be in certain scenes, or was it?
Well, you can't really know how things are going to work until you put it up against the picture. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the music we played in the disco, and they were dancing to. So I think we probably let the music rip for the main dance scene, which is one of the chic dance numbers. I can't remember the title.
Right.
It was kind of a Let's All Dance kind of song.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just played directly, and I always loved Doctor's Orders and wanted to get it in, and there's tons of music we loved and wanted to get in. Oddly, the song we worked with the longest did not get in the final film. It was Upside Down, because it had been in our temp music for Barcelona. It's the music we played in the Mir Servino, Chris Eigeman disco scene, one of them, and we dropped it because we knew we couldn't have expensive Diana Ross song with our budget in Barcelona, but I hope to have it be able to afford it for Last Days of Disco. And it turned out to be the only song which they wouldn't accept our favored nation's, price, low budget film price. It's the only song they'd let us have on Coming Out, but they wouldn't let us have Upside Down for that. So when we got that news, rather than being depressed, we actually thought about it and said we'd gotten sick of the song because we'd been playing it in the temporary track for 2 films. And I actually think On Coming Out was kind of more interesting and better for us. And I think over the long term, On Coming Out, which is a much lesser song considered at the period, less of a hit, I think it's lasted longer. I think On Coming Out is a huge, huge song. And we like both also because we tried to have the idea that Chic was sort of our composer, that we favored Chic songs no matter who was singing or playing them. And the other favorite that we tried to favor was the Philadelphia Sound, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, Gambling Huff, and things like that. Sort of more soul, Philly soul kind of inflected disco music. Those are our favorites.
And that's the stuff played whenever they're outside the club.
When we're outside the club, we want different music. We didn't have any disco music outside the club, and that's where I became obsessed with Jamaican music, because the composer Mark Suazo knew how much I love Baroque music from Barcelona days, and he said, "You'll like this," and brought in the Jamaican music, the ska and rocksteady, and we put it's used 3 times, I think. Queen Majesty, a Curtis Mayfield song re-recorded by the Techniques from Jamaica, is used twice, and a Justin Hines and the Domino song, a really cool song, is in the taxi scene leaving for the airport. Right. And that made me kind of obsessed with Jamaican music, which led to interest in what I hope will be my next film. And then there's also Chai Lights. There is Chicago. There's a Chai Lights song in the Plays and Rexes, and those songs are not included on the CD. The only one I could get on the CD was the Oogum Boogum song, which is not a disco song, but a good late 60s dance song. And people love discovering that song. It's one of my favorites back in the period.
Which also reappeared a couple of years later in Cameron Crowe's Almost Famous. And
oh, really?
Yeah, I was kind of shocked when to hear it again.
Oh, good.
I'm curious start wrapping this up, and then how you feel about, you talk about, when the movie came out, there was criticism, punk versus disco, and you got that about these accusations of inaccuracy and so forth, and that's one thing. But I'm curious about, in that it seems, I'm sure it must seem a little odd in that there's been some, in the film criticism world, that there's been some resistance in these films, be it Metropolitan Barcelona, Last Days of Disco, in that you have dared, if you will, to bring a humanity to this upper, privileged white, tier of society, and brought humanity to it that usually, just as a whole gets dismissed, and yet some critics still seem to resist, their feelings for that. Did you start realizing that with like Barcelona and Last Day of the Disco, and just had to accept that there were going to be kind of critics who were going to just not going to acknowledge the film for class prejudice reasons, maybe?
Yeah, I think we've actually been pretty lucky on generally the higher the criticism, the better we fared. And we get a lot of nasty comments on the internet by people who just don't get it. And I'm sympathetic to those people because some of my favorite writers, writers I ended up liking best, when I first was exposed to them, I really didn't like them, and I whined about how terrible they were, blah, blah, blah. And it was only later that I kind of got into what their angle was and what they were going. And maybe I never particularly liked the particular book that I didn't like at first, but I got to like their work. And I just think a lot of these people are looking at these things the wrong way. They're not getting, there's kind of a key into some of these things, and they just don't quite pick up on it. And I think we might have hoped with some of the sort of negative internet commentators that if they ever get a chance to see the films in another context, they might see what's going on and not say, oh, I hate these people, they're so boring, they're blah, 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 the usual thing. And I mean, the critical reaction I found really absolutely stunning, and I just haven't gotten over. I think I've gotten over everything, and generally we got really good treatment, so I can't complain at all. But the thing was, David Edelstein reviewed it for Slate, and he said he only could stand 10 minutes of Last Days of Disco and walked out. And then he writes kind of a review of the movie based on having seen 10 minutes and brags about having walked out. I just think that's like malfeasance or breaking your fiduciary responsibility. If you're a critic and you can't sit through an entire movie, you shouldn't really write about it, and you shouldn't say anything, I don't think.
Right.
And it's idiotic because I'm sure, in another context, he could have liked the film perfectly well.
Right.
Can I say a last word about that?
Yeah,
there is something very aggressive in the films. There is an aggressive point of view. There is kind of a lot of pushback. And so if people react negatively to that, that is part of the territory. I mean, it is a point of view in the films, and it's saying its point of view. And I hope that it's fair enough. There are enough different angles of it. A lot of it's like an argument, and you think of the next argument, and you put them all in, and you don't make your heroes seem too heroic, and your villains are not too villainy. But there is a lot of aggression in the films, and so if people react against that, it's logical.
Do you, like I said, Sarah, this question has popped in my head. Do you feel as a writer and director, do you have to love all your characters, flaws and all? Because I find myself, when I watch the film, the character of Charlotte, who I guess represents a lot of that pushback, I do, towards the end, as kind of casually cruel as her comments can be, there is something a little, I find, sympathetic about her in that, like everyone else, she's sort of trying. And there is something I find, and I think the fact that in the last scene she's with Dej, Chris Eigeman's character, it's almost as if she's actually, maybe, it's probably fleeting because she is who she is, that she's found someone who probably is sort of as maybe as shallow as she is to a certain extent.
Yeah. And also people are defined by their context. So a mean person, a person who's mean with kind of a soft and kind and defenseless person can be actually a rather good person with another toughie. And so it's possible that Charlotte will become a good person if she ends up with a tough Des character. They could keep each other on the right path, and that Charlotte's aggrandizing behavior could be excited by someone who's a little bit weak, like Alice is in the beginning. And so, yeah, that could work. I think we could have humanized and warmed up the Charlotte character more. She's a little too harsh in the film, and that becomes grating, I think. But yeah, I think she's redeemed in her own way at the end.
And looking back, it's been 11 years since Disco, and I am almost certain in my assumption that you never intended to pull a Stanley Kubrick on us.
No, nor Terrence Malick.
Right, and waiting this long, and but looking back at these three films, and with Disco coming out, are you kind of stunned that each one is as assured and has the point of view that it has for being, technically, I mean, it's your first three films. It's your first film, Metropolitan, and Metropolitan is as strong as it is, when it first came out as being your debut. When you look at them, are you kind of pleased at how well it all turned out?
Yeah, I'm amazed at her good luck with Metropolitan because seemingly nothing going for us. Sometimes that can be good, and I hope that the scripts I've worked on in this period of silence will turn out well. Because I think one of the worst things that can happen is you can be pushed to, well, this is laughable, I won't even say it, but sometimes when people are really in the business and they're valued and they're being pushed and it's a business, making their films, they go ahead with things before they're ready, and we've had the weird, painful luxury of having the projects develop really slowly, and the scripts develop really slowly, and you get second thoughts, and you can improve things, and you can change things. And so I hope when the scripts I've been working on finally see the light of day, if they do see the light of day, it will have taken advantage of some of this time, and that we'll be able to maybe come out with some sort of much faster pace than even we were doing in the 90s.
Right. Well, Mr. Stillman, I know I've kept you probably a little longer than I said I would, but I want to thank you for calling in and for this interview, and it's terrific work, and I do look forward to obviously I do look forward to your next project, and please come back. You have an open invitation.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We're going to continue our show with my interview with Chris Eigeman, actor who's been in all three of Whit Stillman films, Metropolitan, Barcelona, and The Last Days of Disco. Also appeared in the first two Noah Baumbach films, Kickin' and Screamin' and Mr. Jealousy. He's also part of the great but unfortunately short-lived sitcom It's Like You Know. Other appearances include episodes of Fringe, and he's also a writer-director in his own right, having directed the fine movie Turn the River with Rip Torn and Famke Janssen. He has another movie coming up that he's going to start shooting in the spring with Jesse Eisenberg and Colin Hanks. But we begin our interview at the beginning in what first drew Mr. Eigeman to acting. What first drew you to acting?
Oh. I guess it was a combination of I thought I could do it and kind of a lack of interest in other things. I grew up out in Colorado and used to work on a ranch in the summer, and I sort of thought I wanted to be a veterinarian. But that involved, it turns out, a lot of math and a lot of biology that I was particularly good at. So I think that's how I ended up being an actor.
Right. And so how did you originally first start to attempt to go about it? Did you
the first thing
did you think of acting school, or did you think of just doing it on your own?
I got out of college and I went actually to an acting school in London that I got thrown out of pretty quickly. But being thrown out of acting school in London is the process is actually really pleasant. They're incredibly polite about it, and you kind of don't know that it's happened until after it's happened, and it's more of a disinviting than it is an actual throwing you out. So I was in London for a little while. Then I came to New York, and I don't think I ever really tried. I don't think I ever thought about graduate school. I enjoyed school, but I was very, very happy to get out of school.
Right.
So the idea of maybe returning to school didn't hold a lot of appeal for me. So, and then I just, I was in New York City and I parked cars and auditioned. And that's actually how I first met Whit. I auditioned for Metropolitan,
Right. So I guess before you get into disco, how did you come into that situation and become part of that Whit Stillman universe?
I think it was an open audition for, basically anybody who looks like they could have just gotten out of college, which, I mean, it was, I remember it being kind of excruciating because that's the largest possible pool of actors that you're going to find are, 23-year-olds in New York City because, attrition hasn't started to happen with age and the crowd hasn't winnowed out quite yet. So there were thousands upon thousands of people. And I auditioned, I think I auditioned for Whit maybe 2 or 3 times. And then in the end, I guess he was sort of trying to figure out the cast, and in one version of the cast I was not included, and then I guess that version got scrapped, or kind of maybe rejiggered, and then I was included. So I got a phone call, and the next thing I knew, I was being fit for a tuxedo, and there it was.
And if I'm not mistaken, weren't you at one point? I mean, it's kind of hard to believe. I'm sure fans of Metropolitan, you are so identified with the character of Nick Smith, but wasn't early on? Weren't you also part of? I think Whit thought of you as for Tom Townsend.
No, I don't. Well, maybe. I mean, I suppose that's possible. I honestly don't know. I don't think so. I think I was either not in the movie, or I was going to be the part that I played, Nick. But maybe in Whit's mind, I was going to be Tom. It was all so kind of mysterious about how this movie was going to get made anyway, and if I was going to be involved, and and I'd never made a movie, so just about everything was new.
And when you read that script, I mean, you're like as you said, you're struggling actor in New York, and you said
right.
This is the longest, this is the largest pool you can take from. But when you read the script, I'm curious, before you got into it, what was your reaction? Did you think, wow, this is really good, or were you of the mind that actually this is kind of maybe a little too wordy and this seems a little overambitious for a first timer? What was your initial impression of?
I think my initial response was, oh God, it's a movie and it's going to get made, so let's try to get in it. That I think was, I think questions about style and quality were almost secondary to the fact that it existed. Mm-hmm. I do remember finding it very funny. I mean, I thought it was incredibly well written, but I thought it was really funny, but that's because I sort of thought I knew what he was up to, because I know a lot of other people who at the time were auditioning for it or whatever who didn't really understand that it was funny. Mm-hmm. And I found that kind of encouraging, although, of course, when there was a moment when I wasn't in the movie, I found that excruciatingly discouraging. But I thought that was, but at the same time, I don't think anybody could help but wonder, how is this going to come out, and would that, I think doing it a different way, I think one of the great successes of that film is, and one of the great abilities of Whit, is that a sort of delicacy and a almost gentleness exists in the movie, and it doesn't. I mean, you could easily sell these characters down the river in a heartbeat. I mean, you could easily make fun of them,
right?
And
because they're so hermetically sealed in their own universe, and they while they're very articulate and educated, they have no real interaction with other cultures in New York.
Right. No, it was, we always thought maybe it was going to play it like the Margaret Mead documentary festival somewhere. I think that one of Whit's great talents is that he'll let characters really speak for themselves, and in many ways betray themselves, and that's that's a tricky thing to do, and it's a thing that is born of confidence. It isn't born of you don't stumble into that position when you're writing or directing a film.
Right. And when that film came out and it did become a critical hit and Whit got nominated, did you? How soon after did you realize that the casting agents were going? You became kind of this go-to guy. Oh, we need someone kind of sarcastic and preppy New York.
Yeah, that happened pretty quickly. I mean, look, if the first movie you do that anybody sees, and in this case it was the first movie I ever made, you're wearing a cummerbund, holding a drink, smoking a cigarette, and cracking wise, like some sort of demon offspring of Fitzgerald and J.D. Salinger, you know, that is what people are going to assume. There's no getting around it. And some days that could be.
Do you find that kind of amusing, considering, you know,
some days I find it amusing. Some days I find it irritating. Sometimes I find it great. It really goes by the day. You know, it isn't.
And so when
you're not going to be able to fight it, really.
Right.
You know what I mean?
So when Barcelona came as Whit's next film, did you? First of all, was that part of Fred written for you in mind? And also, when it was shown to you, did you think, well, here's a chance of me breaking from that by not taking this?
Well, yeah, I think the part of Fred was written for me. I think that well, I think it was sort of written for me, although I've also heard Whit say that Barcelona was perhaps written before Metropolitan, but I think Barcelona was a movie he wanted to make before Metropolitan. But I knew that doing Barcelona, it wasn't going to unburden me of whatever sort of the way people thought of me coming out of Metropolitan. If anything, I thought it would probably reinforce it, because, you know, it is a very, very specific kind of humor. It's a very specific quality, and so if you're going to dip into that well again, you're really just going to be reinforcing it, which was fine. I had no problem with that. I think, you know, Barcelona was enormously fun to make. I'm proud of all of them. And at some point, you just don't care. At some point, you're like, well, you know, I think you can get really careerist about it and worry about, well, you know, if I do another one of these, nobody's going to let me carry a gun in a movie. and that's fine, but I think if you do that at your own peril, because you might not be doing the most interesting work that you could do.
And is that, and when you ask that, you know, no one will let me carry a gun, is the follow-up question then to yourself is like, well, wait a minute, do I want to carry a gun in a movie?
Yeah, I think you really you just play the cards that are dealt you. So I just sort of rolled with it and feel pretty privileged to have worked with Whit in the films that we've done, as well as some of the other directors that I've worked with. So, you know, there's everything can have an irritating side, but that's a pretty small sliver in the grand scheme of things.
And on Barcelona, because it's not only is it you and Whit, but also Taylor Nichols, did you three feel that in those intervening 4 years that, you know, everyone's confidence level had gone up, and also what had a shorthand been developed that you all knew each other on each other's wavelength on what needed to be done?
Yeah, I mean, Whit and I and Taylor also, you know, we had become pretty good friends. Taylor and I remained really close friends also. So there was a shorthand. But, you know, I found that shorthand with Whit really early on. There was a scene in Metropolitan, one of the first scenes we shot, and it was one of those long, sort of trademark Whit Stillman dialogue runs that involved, I think, detachable collars and something like that. And I was sort of close to it, kind of was working, kind of wasn't working. We both knew it was sort of not working. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning on Park Avenue, and Whit came running up, and he's like, you know what it is? It needs to be exquisite bullshit. And the notion of exquisite bullshit, and I assume you can say that on this radio program, but maybe you can't. You have to beep it. I apologize.
No, feel free.
That to me is a lot of. It's not the way Whit writes for everybody, but it is the way that he would write for me, where my characters would tend to say things that, on the one hand, aren't true, but on the other hand, are absolutely true. And maybe are emotionally true. But on the other hand, they're just completely made up, but they're so damn beautiful that you sort of have to acknowledge their beauty.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the beginning of the shorthand, and that's run throughout all three films, I think.
Right. And before I get to Last Day of the Disco, I got to ask about the film you did right after Barcelona, and also you developed an acting, directing relationship with Noah Baumbach.
Yeah.
Did his first film, Kicking and Screaming,
right?
Which also playing a character, kind of the sardonic wise guy. And so, what was that like? What was the decision process on that one?
I really wanted to be a part of Kicking and Screaming. I really liked the cast. A lot of those people, some of those people were my friends before the movie started, and I thought the movie was just incredibly funny. On the page, I thought the movie was very funny. I remember getting to the reading, and there was a scene where I'm out on a date, and she's driving the car, and there's trying to park, and there's a guy behind us in a truck with a bumper sticker that says, "I'd rather be bow hunting." And there was this sort of comic run about bow hunting, and I thought, I really very much want to be part of this movie.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, the character I play there is certainly verbally acute and funny, and I think that he's a very different guy than appears in Whit's films sometimes. But
he's a bit of a scoundrel and a jerk. As opposed to in the characters in the Whit films, where he's a little articulate, but a little naive, and more so than he thinks. But the character.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that in Whit's characters tend to be much more gentle than they're given credit for, and actually much less confident than they seem.
Right.
And I think actually the opposite is true in Noah's films, at least with my experience, where those characters are all incredibly confident. I mean, to their own detriment at times, but but people will draw similarities, between the two anyway, because that's what people do.
Right. And so then finally we get to Last Day of the Disco, and so that comes, and if I'm not mistaken, there was actually a real, not only because of the studio pressure, but there actually was a time where I think both of y'all said, well, maybe this one will sit it out. Is that true?
Oh, yeah, that was absolutely true. I mean, that was like not it. I mean, it wasn't even like, pretending that we weren't going to do it together, knowing that we were going to do it together. We weren't going to do this. I helped him a little bit when he was in early stages of casting for some of the women, and so I would come in occasionally and read with people, but that was it. And we both knew it served everybody for me not to be in the picture. It served Whit because he needed, he was dealing with studio pressures, obviously, to get somebody famous and studio approved. But also, I think it probably, Whit was thinking I should probably start working with other people anyway. And I was thinking, this might be fine to sit this one out because, this would just cement the deal of, starting with Metropolitan and running all the way through. And, that was a little bittersweet because it was strange to think of Whit going off making a film without me. But at the same time, we were all really upfront about it, that we were just not going to do this. And then, and I'm not really sure how it all came to be. I know that I've heard that there were people, other actors involved, and that it didn't work out. And I assumed that, when Whit petitioned to get me in it, there was a certain amount of blood on the floor, and I'm certainly appreciative of that. And then the next thing I know, we're doing the film.
And it's funny, when I talked to Whit, I made the point of that at the time, studio pressures of getting getting bigger name indie stars or whatnot. And I asked him, it must be kind of amusing and kind of bittersweet that if he was to do the film today, they would want Chloe Sevigny and Kate Beckinsale.
Yeah.
In the film.
Yeah. Now, whether they'd want me or not is an open question, but I think you're right. I think, and also, if you watch Whit with actresses, Whit has a very good eye with actors. I mean, a lot of those actresses that Mira and Barcelona, like they all go off to pretty good stuff.
And did you notice on Last Day of the Disco? I mean, you've been in his 3 films, and so what could you tell the evolution of his directing from Metropolitan to Last Day of the Disco? Had he changed his technique or style, or was it just a matter of...
No, I don't think he ever really changed his style. But I do think that with Disco, the budget was much, much larger, so there were many, many more people around. I mean, there were just a lot more people on set. Mm-hmm. And we were dealing with a huge set piece with that Disco anyway. So I think the only difference is, Whit is really good about being able to sort of tune out all the distractions that are around on a set. Mm. And I think on Disco, he really had to work hard to tune them out because there were a ton of people.
Right.
And I would say that would be the only difference.
And was it contractually obligated that you were not going to dance in the film?
It was not contractually obligated in as much as it just wasn't going to happen. He got me to dance in one movie by kind of faking me out and saying we were going to cut in Barcelona. We were going to cut before, and he didn't. And I was like, okay, that's it. We're done now. Now we're not. Now I'm not even going to try to give you a quick cut point so that I can go down the dance floor and you'll cut before. Like I'm not even going near it. So this is just the assumption. I will not be dancing. I think the only people who dance in that movie are Kate and Chloe dance. Oh, I get Matt dances.
Matt, and even Robert Sean Leonard gets a little.
Oh, does he? Yeah.
Gets a little move in there.
Robert Sean Leonard called me. What did he say? Oh, see, now I can't remember what it was. It was a funny line. It'll come to me.
Well, and I'm curious. Were you, when you did that film? Because this was you were pretty young during this disco era. So were you aware of the disco stuff, or did you learn more about disco from doing that film than maybe you had awareness beforehand?
There was one, I think probably in like 74, 75, 75, 76 maybe. Mm-hmm. There was one disco in Denver that it was a steakhouse during the day, and then at night it turned into a disco, and it was called something like the Ground Round or like the Top Tenderloin or something like that. Something that somehow worked both for a steakhouse and for a disco, and I remember sneaking in and getting into it when I was way, way, way too young. And that was basically my only experience. I mean, when I was in high school, we would come into New York City sometime. I went to high school up in Vermont, and we would come down to the city, and so clubs like, the Tunnel and Limelight, and I don't think 54 was around. They existed, and I would go to those occasionally. But I was really of the school that disco sucks. That was, I was firmly rooted in that. Mm-hmm.
And well, to start wrapping this up, when you see these 3 films, together, this unofficial, as some critics like to call it, Whit Stillman's unofficial Wasp trilogy of early 80s.
Right.
What do you think when you look at those films and your participation in them?
Well, my participation, I don't really think about very much, in a way. But what I do, I think the films are really interesting because they strike me as films about or stories about groups and how groups of people how everybody clings to each other for support and surviving and finding mates and all of that, and how society is pulling these groups apart. Mm-hmm. That's certainly true of Metropolitan. I think it's kind of true of Barcelona, and it's clearly true, I think, of disco.
Right.
That, you could argue it's about the death of disco, but it really isn't. I mean, in terms of the movie, it's really about the loss of this group of
mm-hmm.
friends, and how all of his movies seem to end with individuals,
mm-hmm.
Wandering away. In disco, it's me and Kate, or Kate and I, kind of going off. But it's that last scene around the unemployment office, and everybody just sort of scatters. And that's similar with Metropolitan also. I think that I think that kind of sadness is really an underpinning of his films.
Right. Well, I got to ask one quick question, because every one of the films that you've done with Stillman, you always get a monologue, more or less, that becomes kind of the one that you become famous for, whether it's the Rick Von Flanagan monologue of Metropolitan and kind of
right.
the duet on Lady and the Tramp and Disco. But I got to ask you about my favorite monologue from Barcelona, and that's on The Graduate.
I loved that thing. I thought that was, I thought who but Whit Stillman would tell The Graduate from the point of view of the jilted groom at the altar. Like, no one has ever really thought about it. And like the makeout king in his
right.
fraternity at Berkeley, I agree with you. I think it's incredibly funny. I think there's a bunch of those that are really funny. I think the run on Graduate is funny. I think the text-subtext thing is very funny. I'm very happy to get a good, healthy 2-page monologue. I am most unhappy and at my worst when I have, one line, in a scene, because the pressure is just too much and I screw it up all the time.
Well, before I let you go, I'll just ask, what are you working on? What are you working on next?
I'm directing a film this spring that I wrote.
Oh, great.
So, yeah, it should. It's Jesse Eisenberg and Colin Hanks and Felicity Jones, who's a British actor.
Well, Jesse Eisenberg's amazing. I thought
he's an incredible actor.
Adventureland is my favorite film of the year so far.
Oh, really? Yeah, Adventureland's wonderful. Greg Matola, I think, did a great. I agree with you. I think it's a really beautiful film. I think it's just coming out on video right now.
Yeah, next week, and it's spectacular. I've seen it 6 times. It's amazing.
Yeah, he's amazing.
And are you doing any more spots on episodic television? Anything coming up?
Because I've sort of been buried in some kind of pre-production on this thing, I have not done any. I haven't acted in a little while, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly hope to again.
Right. And I'll get that lastly. We keep hearing rumblings, and Whit talked about this, about, he's got several things that, are in, planning phases. And I'm just curious, you said, like, on Disco that you've helped out, you did table reads and so forth. Have you been in contact with Whit, and have you read any of the stuff that he's working on?
I haven't, but I think that's, it could be that I'm not right for any of them, so he's just trying to spare me bad feelings.
Right.
But I've only heard sort of titles or sort of notions of films that he's up to, but I don't know a lot about any of them. But look, I hope he gets one going.
Yeah, me too. Well, Mr. Eigeman, I want to thank you for taking the time out for talking to me. I'm very appreciative that you're a fan of the show. I do appreciate it, and I'm a fan of your work.
Thank you.
We have a special guest joining us. As you may have heard earlier in the Whit Stillman portion of the interview of the show, Stillman talked about the critical responses that his films have received and said he's been mostly lucky with all the good notices, but said one review that he was never really able to get over, which was that of David Edelstein, formerly of Slate, who Stillman says walked out after 10 minutes. Well, that is actually inaccurate. Mr. Edelstein did not walk out after 10 minutes, but Stillman remembers it that way. Well, Edelstein is on the line and has joined us to set the record straight. He has been a film critic for going on 25 years, beginning with the Boston Phoenix and moving on to Village Voice and the New York Post. He was at Slate.com for almost a decade, and now he is the lead critic at New York Magazine. You can also hear his reviews weekly on Fresh Air with Terry Gross on NPR, and also see him on this CBS Sunday This Morning. He's a good friend of mine. I'm honored to welcome David Edelstein.
Hi, Aaron. Aaron, how are you?
How you doing, sir?
Thanks for inviting me on under these grim circumstances.
Yes.
Wait. Let me just say first, I didn't even know if it was a good idea to come on as I wrote you. Back in '98, I wrote what I wrote, and I'm not going to wuss out. I stand by the review, but it's a review that's bothered me for all these 11 years. So
right.
Maybe it's good to unburden myself. Thank you for saying that I did not stay for 10 minutes. I stayed for 90 minutes. And I didn't walk out of a critic screening. I don't do that. I saw it in a largely empty theater on the Upper East Side after it had already opened in New York. And it got good reviews from the major New York papers, by the way. So I didn't kill it commercially. And here's the thing. I just want to make it clear. I had no intention of writing about it. But later that week, I got a call from my editor saying, "Are you reviewing the Whit Stillman movie?" And I said, "No, I walked out." And she said, "Oh, because they want you to write something about him in your column." And I said, "I walked." And she says, "Well, write that. That would be interesting." Now, I should say I raved Metropolitan and the New York Post, and I liked Barcelona, though I wasn't reviewing movies when it opened. I didn't want to bash Whit Stillman especially. You should remember, Slate wasn't even 2 years old. It was not, at the time, a well-read publication. And I didn't think there was even the remotest chance Whit Stillman would read what I wrote or particularly give a damn, given his movie was opening wide across the country that week. So. I wrote the review, just a paragraph or two, I can't remember, as part of a larger column, and it went up, and then there was that holy shit moment. Slate at the time had a feature called the Slate Diary. Some accomplished person would write a daily diary entry. This was pre-blogs. And the diarist that week was, you ready?
Yeah.
Whit Stillman. And when I saw that, I freaked out. I wrote to Mike Kinsley, the founding editor of Slate, and I said, "Why the hell did you want me to write about this movie? Why didn't you tell me Stillman was doing the diary?" Because he's like a guest in our house, and you don't shit on a guest in your house. He's in Slate writing about the anxiety surrounding the opening of his movie, and next to him is this review. And I might be an asshole, but I'm not, a sadist. And Mike wrote back. He said, "You're right. You're absolutely right. I'm really sorry. It was a huge oversight. You should have been told, blah, blah, blah." So I said, "Okay, fine. Let's take the review off the site, and I think I should write to Stillman and tell him I had no idea he was doing the diary." And Mike said, "Well, it's up. We can't take it back. My advice, drop the whole thing." He said, "I've known Whit for many years." It turns out he and Kinsley were at Harvard together or somewhere. I think it was Harvard. "And he'll get over it. He's a pretty tough guy. Don't worry about it." So that was that. But then over the years, I heard from people he hated my guts. And you know what? Given the circumstances, I don't blame him at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, and like I said, it wasn't until after I had done the interview and recorded the interview with Whit Stillman and I think I'd emailed you and said, hey, or I left a phone message, and then you emailed and gave me this backstory that I went on and I went looking for the review. It's actually a little hard to find, but it is still online.
Good, I'm glad.
And it is, and you're right. It's the last portion of a
long column. Yeah.
The long column. I think the big film you reviewed was actually The Truman Show.
Right. I think I was mixed favorable. I think it was mixed.
Mixed favorable. Yeah.
I am mixed on this. So I hope I was.
And it was there, and then it said 90 minutes, and so.
Wait, let me just say, I don't hate Whit Stillman's work at all. You know, I said I raved Metropolitan. I think he's in a tradition of American writers, not exactly satirists, people like Henry James and Edith Wharton who have a satiric perspective, but also a lot of empathy. You know, they show the way people's ideas, their ways of seeing the world are always tripping over their emotions, and their emotions are always tripping over their ideas. Now, I didn't like The Last Days of Disco because I thought he got the energy of the era all wrong. And the energy, the sexuality, the rush, the stroboscopic rush, you know, was central to the ways in which I saw people in that era communicating. But, I'm not going to re-review the movie, only say that I deeply, deeply regret the context in which that review was published, and I bet you anything I've given it more thought over the years than even Whit Stillman.
Right. Well, and just so we can end on kind of a more positive note, in that going back to where this all started, Metropolitan, I said at the opening of the show when I was introducing the theme of the show of the films of Whit Stillman, and that, you know, critics glibly labeled him kind of the WASP Woody Allen, which he's not. And I said the way I look at Whit Stillman, he kind of does for WASP what in the early years Spike Lee did for the African American middle class, which is to kind of acknowledge the existence of WASP and to locate the humanity that kind of that I think even liberal critics kind of just kind of scoff at.
I think there are similarities among all these people, but I think Stillman's influences go even further back. Like I said, I think there's a great tradition of very verbal, very intellectual characters, or characters who attempt to articulate their feelings and who have very strong views of the world, and how their feelings and their ideas are always sort of stumbling all over each other. It's almost a kind of intellectual slapstick, but it's played very deadpan. And, you know, certainly in Barcelona, his Americans Abroad movie, and Metropolitan, his sort of, Upper East Side,
Christmas
rich
Tale.
kids, Christmas Tale. I think he really nailed that. I should see Last Days of Disco again, because I, as you know, I trust your taste. I respect it, and even when we disagree, and it might be worth another look. Although, to be honest, it's very hard to take a look at something that you've written something vicious about again and not be thinking the whole time, oh God, it's hard to look at it neutrally. I'd rather go on and see the next Whit Stillman movie, which I honestly, no matter what the hell he says about me, I'm so looking forward to, because I really do respect him. That review of Last Days of Disco is notwithstanding. Look, if you're a critic wherever, the Times, your own blog, you're going to be adversarial. You're going to hurt people. I've accepted that. I've lost some friends, but in that particular case, it was a bad thing all around. Ultimately, it was my responsibility, but I'm going to continue to blame the hell out of my editors all the same.
Well, David, I want to thank you for coming on the show. And
Aaron, it's a great pleasure. Great pleasure as always.
All right. Well, I
love your work. Okay.
I will talk to you soon,
right.
man.
Bye.
That was film critic David Edelstein of New York Magazine, setting the record straight about a comment Whit Stillman made in our interview. And either way, I recommend you go out and pick up The Last Days of Disco. Fine film. Just out yesterday by the Criterion Collection. And pick up Stillman's other films, Metropolitan, also in the Criterion Collection, and Barcelona from Castle Rock Entertainment.